So today, I want to talk about something that it's been on my mind. It's been apparently on Mr. Shaby's mind as well. Maybe not in this exact context, but he's spoken to a lot of us about something related to this lately, and it's a subject I wanted to speak about. And I was thinking I have this bright orange tie I was going to wear today, and I thought, well, everybody's going to think I'm a Gator fan because it's a Georgia-Florida weekend, so there's no way I can do that. So then I asked my wife, I said, is there a color associated with hypocrisy? Maybe I should wear that one because this is a topic that is near and dear to me because it's one I'm not very good at myself. So as we're going through this today, I'm talking as much to me as I am to anyone as we go through this message. But it's about the concept of hospitality. What do we think of when we think of hospitality? You know, you can get a college degree in hospitality today. There's an industry, a hospitality industry. But what do you think of when you think of hospitality? And do you think of it from the perspective of the Bible and what the Bible says about it? Is it even important? Is it a real important concept that we should know about? I think once we finish today, we're going to see that it's an extremely important concept, not only to practice, as we'll see. I mean, it's really kind of a step short of just being one of the commandments. I mean, it's kind of implied through the commandments of God, but we'll see that it's very heavily integrated in the Bible, and perhaps we don't even realize when we look through it, if we don't recognize the history and the culture of that time and what hospitality meant at that time and how it was practiced at that time. Once we start peeling that back and we see what it meant in its original context, not what it means to us today, but what it meant to those people at that time, we'll see that it is permeated throughout the Scriptures as an extremely important concept. Wars were waged over this concept, believe it or not. And we're going to see that as we go through today. First, I'd just like to throw out some quotes that I found on the internet, just trying to get an idea of, what do we think of as hospitality today. Here's some of the quotes I found. Visitors' footfalls are like medicine. They heal the sick. Well, that's a nice thought. Here's one of my favorites. This probably says too much about me, though. Hospitality is making your guest feel at home, even if you wish they were. Another one. Visitors always bring joy. If not when they arrive, then when they leave. But here's one that's probably more in line with how I and we should be thinking. Greet the stranger as if you are greeting God. So there are different ideas, obviously, about hospitality. We're going to go through the Bible today and try to get a picture, an understanding of what this concept really is all about, what it means, and how it can help us understand some of the Scriptures, some difficult Scriptures even, some of the things that a lot of people don't understand in the world today. We're going to define hospitality through the pages of the Bible, and we'll use some other helps as well. But first, let's just look at a few scriptures here to see why it's important to examine the concept. Let's look at 1 Peter 4. See why we should even bother examining this subject. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7. As you're turning over there, if you're looking for a title, it's Be Hospitable. Be hospitable. 1 Peter chapter 4, and beginning down in verse 7, it says, the end of all things is at hand. So, we can kind of think about the end of all things. This was sort of sets the mindset that Peter had here when he was talking about the verses that follow here. We can kind of think he was thinking of sort of an end time kind of setting. The end of all things is at hand. He says, therefore, be serious and watchful in your prayers. And above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. And verse 9, be hospitable to one another without grumbling. Be hospitable. He kind of put that in as a command. If you read it in some other translations, they don't use it quite as powerfully. It's like use hospitality, different things of that nature. But in the context, it clearly is almost a command. Be hospitable to one another. And when we think about that in the end-time context, and we think about what we believe is going to happen to the church in the end of the age, we can kind of understand that's going to be an important concept of practice coming down the road for us. So we need to really get an understanding of it. Jamieson Fawcett Brown in this verse 9 here about being hospitable, they say this is not the spurious hospitality which passes current in the world, but the entertaining of those needing it, especially those exiled for the faith. As the representatives of Christ, and all hospitality to whomever exercise from genuine Christian love, their take on it. And they use this without grudging. They say it's murmuring, without murmuring. It says, he that gives, let him do it with simplicity. That is open-hearted sincerity with cordiality, not secretly speaking against the person whom you entertain. So that gives us a little bit of a concept, but we see that, at least in Peter's mind, we're thinking about the end of all things coming, that hospitality is going to be important. We should be hospitable to one another. Let's look at 1 Timothy 3. 1 Timothy chapter 3, we'll begin here in verse 1. We talk about the qualifications, you might say, of a bishop or an elder, a leader in the work in the church. And they're supposed to follow Christ's example, right? And well, we're supposed to follow that example too. So this applies equally to all of us. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, this is a faithful saying, if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, here are the qualifications, must be blameless, husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach. And of course it goes on through another, some more items there. But we'll focus on this, hospitable, that's one of the qualifications. So, stands to reason, it's something that we need to be focusing on. We need to pay attention to. Let's look and see a little more here in the New Testament while we're here in 1 Timothy 5. Let's look at 1 Timothy 5 because this is something that may surprise us a little bit. It really shows how much importance is stressed on being hospitable. Verse 9, we're talking about widows here. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number. This is someone who is going to be provided for, basically, by the church, giving some instructions and saying, don't just take anybody, but people who have certain qualities, who've set an example, who are loyal, who wouldn't be taking advantage of the system, but people who meet these qualifications. Says, do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, not unless she's been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, she's brought up children, if she's lodged strangers. The word here is if she's been hospitable. She's shown hospitality. If she hasn't been hospitable, if she hasn't shown hospitality, then she might not be eligible for assistance under this verse. That's a topic of importance. It really is. Let's see if we can define it a little bit better through some dictionaries, various dictionaries. Webster's New World Dictionary defines hospitality as the act, practice, or quality of being hospitable. I always love those kinds of definitions. Yeah, wow. Thanks. Now I understand completely. They go on, though, to define the word hospitable as friendly and solicitous toward guests, new arrivals, etc. That's still not that particularly helpful. That's how we would define it today. So I looked in Holman Bible Dictionary, and they define it a little more like this. It says, to entertain or receive a stranger or sojourner into one's home as an honored guest and to provide the guest with food, shelter, and protection. A little more obligation involved here. Now we're starting to get a little more serious. To provide the guest, even a stranger, a sojourner, with food, shelter, and protection. And we're going to see this throughout the Bible where hospitality meets this definition. This was not merely an Oriental custom or good manners, but a sacred duty that everyone was expected to observe. Only the depraved would violate this obligation. It goes on, hospitality probably grew out of the needs of a nomadic life. Since public inns were very rare, a traveler had to depend on the kindness of others and had a right to expect it. This practice was extended to every sojourner, even a runaway slave like Onesimus or one's archenemy. The reason for, and there's a lot of scriptures listed in this definition. It's a Bible dictionary, but I'm going to skip those because we're going to cover some of them as we go. It says the reason for practicing hospitality was that the Israelites themselves were once strangers in the land of Egypt. Some acts of hospitality were rewarded throughout the Bible, most notable of which was Rahab's. Breaches of hospitality were condemned and punished, such as those of Sodom and Gibeah. Hospitality seemed to form the background of many details in the life of Jesus in the early church, and we're going to see that as we go. But just one more dictionary, if you will. This is actually not really a dictionary definition. This is from the Jewish Encyclopedia. Because I wanted to get in and see, what they understand from their culture, this hospitality to be from the Bible. And this really starts to shed even more light as we dig deeper. On the subject of hospitality, the Jewish Encyclopedia says, the ger, or the sojourner who lived with a Hebrew family or clan, was assured by biblical law not only of protection against oppression and deceit, but also of love from the natives, who were to love him even as themselves. He was to be invited to participate in the family and even the festivals, with the Passover accepted. And even in the latter, he could take part if he submitted to circumcision. Of course, that means a whole way of life. He received a share in the tithes distributed among the poor. When you think about it, in Deuteronomy 14, where it goes through, talks about the second tithe, and then on the third tithe a little bit, it mentions the stranger here. It says, and one law and one statute applied equally to the native and to him. From scattered references, an idea can be formed of the manner in which a guest was received in an ancient Jewish household and of the relations that existed between guest and host. The latter, that is, the host, would go out to meet the stranger on his way. Wouldn't even wait for them to arrive, but would go out and meet them as they were approaching. That's going to be important. We're going to see an interesting couple things in the Bible on that subject. They would go out and meet them on the way to receive them, and would ask no questions as to his name or condition until his first needs had been satisfied. On entering the house, he was given water to wash his feet. Remember some of these steps. We're going to see them all throughout the Bible. And a meal was then put before him, his animals being meanwhile attended to. During his stay, the host felt himself personally responsible for any injury that might befall his guest. And on leaving, another meal was served, when a covenant was sometimes entered into by the guest and his host. And the latter again accompanied the stranger some distance on his way. On his part, the guest blessed the host before taking leave and asked him whether he stood in need of anything. And if the guest wished to remain in the clan or in the locality, he was permitted to select a dwelling. The practice of hospitality did not decline with the changes in social conditions, but even in later times, when the Jews were settled in cities, the virtue was still held in highest esteem. Among the ethical teachings of the rabbis, the duties of hospitality occupy a very prominent position. Abraham and Job were regarded by the rabbis as the models of Jewish hospitality. In fact, if you read one of the things Job defends himself for, and then is later accused of, or earlier accused of, I should say, is related to hospitality, whether he was hospitable or not, if that's why he was going through some of his conditions. Numerous legends cluster about these names in the Haggadah, I can't pronounce it, Haggadah, that word, literature, illustrative of their generosity and hospitality. The doors of their houses were open at each of the four corners, according to the rabbinical tradition, so that strangers coming from any side might find ready access. Of Job, it's related that he had 40 tables spread at all times for strangers and 12 tables for widows. We don't know if that's true or not. That's not biblical, but that's in the Jewish tradition. To sit long at the table so as to give an opportunity to the belated poor to enter and partake of the meal was regarded as highly meritorious, for which one's days on earth would be prolonged. And in Jerusalem, the custom prevailed of displaying a flag at the front door indicating a meal was ready and the guests might come in and partake. The removal of the flag, a sign the meal was finished and the guests should cease entering. It's the duty of the host that goes on to be cheerful during meals, thus make his guest feel at home and comfortable at the table. Commendable that the host himself serve at the table, thereby showing his willingness to satisfy his guest. So you're just going on, it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper into this meaning and the intent of hospitality. The host is warned against watching his guest too attentively at the table, for thereby the visitor may be led to abstain from eating as such as he would like. It was the custom with some in Jerusalem to place all the dishes on the table at once, so the fastidious guest was not compelled to eat something he did not desire, but might choose anything he wished. The guest was expected to leave some of the food on his dish to show that he had more than enough. If, however, the host asked him to finish his portion, it was not necessary to leave any on the plate. The habitual parasite, who took every opportunity to partake of meals at the house of another, was very strongly denounced by the rabbis, especially if the parasite happened to be a scholar. So that's some of the Jewish encyclopedia's definition of hospitality. So based on those definitions, we can already get an idea that the hospitality in the Bible meant something a little deeper than maybe we think of whenever we think of the hospitality industry today, or a hotel, or just having guests over or something of that nature. There was a lot more to it in the culture of that day. So let's start looking in to see how it was used in the Bible. Let's look at Luke 19. We're going to see a lot of the things we just read in full display as we go through a number of accounts here in the Bible. We won't go through all because it's just permeated throughout the Bible. This is a huge study if you want to go and see all the various ways it was used and the various times that it met up with these definitions we just discussed. But Luke 19, verse 1, Jesus entered to pass through Jericho. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, and he was of short stature. So he ran ahead and climbed up to a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house. Now, obviously, they didn't know each other. Zacchaeus wanted to see who he was. So it seems like a little bit of a presumptuous thing for Jesus to say, well, he's the Son of God. I mean, he spoke with authority, right? And we can kind of make excuses for why Christ was a little bit presumptuous in this case. Hey, Zacchaeus, never met you before. I'm staying at your house. But remember what we read about the idea of hospitality in those days. A traveler had the right to expect that you would lodge them. That's how deeply permeated in society it was. So this didn't offend Zacchaeus. It was Christ's right as a traveler to ask, hey, I want to come stay at your place tonight. In our culture today, if you invite yourself over to someone's house, that's considered impolite. Now, you got to be clever about it, right? Hey, I'm going to be up in your place for a few days. Know of any hotel? You got to be clever. But not back then. It wasn't that way in that society. Christ's like, hey, I'm coming to your place tonight. So, what did Zacchaeus do? He made haste and came down and received him joyfully, just as he should have, because he was hospitable. Let's look at Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, an example of hospitality that maybe we've never thought of in this context before. We've read it a million times. Luke chapter 10 and verse 30. Jesus answered and said, a certain man went down to Jerusalem from Jericho, fell among thieves who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance, a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And of course, the Levite, when he arrived at the place, came, looked, passed by on the other side. But then the Samaritan, what we call the Good Samaritan, today, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him as an own animal, brought him to an inn, took care of him. This was the biblical concept of hospitality. Though this was not his guest, his personal guest, though he was a stranger, he was someone in need. Here he was, a man on the wayside who had need of someone to help him, to take care of him. The Levite and the priest passed him by. They were not hospitable towards this man. But the Samaritan, understanding hospitality and how it governed society at that time as one of the cultural norms, had compassion, bandaged him, took personal responsibility to take care of this person. Pouring oil and wine, and he set him on his animal, brought him to an inn, took care of him. On the next day when he departed, he took 2 denarii, gave him to the innkeeper, said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you. That's a little tougher concept of hospitality than maybe what we're used to. But that's what was being practiced here, the biblical form of hospitality. So whenever Peter says in the end times, in the end of the age, when the end of all things is near, be hospitable to one another, this is what he's talking about. Taking the personal responsibility to look out for one another. Not just say, hey, you're coming down? Sure. Why don't you stay with us instead of spending money at the hotel? No, this goes further. And this is where I think a whole lot of us, including me, fall short, because it requires looking outward and anticipating the needs of others the way Christ did. And of course, we know the rest of the lesson there. Christ said, who showed mercy? Who was the neighbor essentially here? Go and do likewise. Let's look at Romans chapter 16, another example. Romans chapter 16 and verse 1. Paul says, I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a servant, a deaconess of the church in Centuria, that you may receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and assist her in whatever business she has need of you. I mean, that's a pretty big ask, right? For indeed she has been a helper of many, and myself also. Now, is this Paul just using his apostolic authority to place a demand on the church? Hey, you better take care of her. No, he's imploring them, using at that time, the cultural norm, saying, be hospitable to her. Fulfill your obligations under the rules of hospitality. take care of her. Take care of her needs. She's coming to your area. Be sure to receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints. Fulfill your obligations, is essentially what he's saying. Fulfill your obligation, because that's your obligation. Now, there are a lot of other examples here in the Bible that we could go through and talk about. I'll just mention a couple, and we won't go into any detail, but you can think about Elijah and the widow, where he went and lodged. Actually, you know what? Let's look at it anyway. Let's look at it. 1 Kings 17. Just look at it, because this goes way back prior to Christ's time, prior to the New Testament time. It shows that this was something that existed for a long time throughout the Bible. But 1 Kings 17, verse 10, just have to look at it because it's so profound. Elijah here, he arose in verse 10 of 1 Kings 17, and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, indeed a widow was there gathering sticks, and he called to her and said, "Please bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink." It's a widow gathering sticks. Remember the widows? They were supposed to be hospitable. That was one of the things. So here, Elijah, a healthy guy coming in, and he's demanding of a widow. We think, oh, wow. But he tells her, hey, bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink. And as she was going to get it, there's no argument, no question, stranger walks up, widow out doing her work, gathering sticks. Stranger walks up, hey, I want some water. She immediately goes to get it. And as she was going to get it, he called out to her and said, oh, bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. It wasn't rude. It was the culturally accepted practice. It was understood. Elijah had the right to ask that. And she had the obligation to assist. Verse 12, so she said, as the Lord your God lives, I don't have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And see, I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Now, she wasn't very well off. And here Elijah was demanding this of her, and she's like, look, I don't have anything to give to you. Elijah was undeterred, says, hey, don't fear. Go to his, as you've said, but make me a small cake from it first. And she did. And of course, we know God intervened in that situation because she fulfilled her obligation. Now, whenever we look at it and we think, well, God took care of her because it was Elijah, and, well, she had faith in Elijah, or she had faith in God, and so forth. She fulfilled her obligation as God expected her to. She was obedient to her responsibilities under the concept of hospitality. She took care of God's servant, and God blessed her richly, even healing her son so he didn't die. We could look at examples of Paul whenever he was shipwrecked in Malta, how they came out and took care of Paul. And then even whenever they sent him on his way, they made sure he had plenty of supplies to go on his way and blessed him. And of course, they were blessed as a result of that because many people were healed by Paul while he visited there for a few months. In fact, it was interesting to me because I was looking at Malta a while back, quite a while back now, and just looking at the geography, and I noticed there's a bay there on the east coast where a ship would have been drifting across the Mediterranean that's called, to this day, St. Paul's Bay. Kind of interesting. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 13. Hebrews 13 and verse 1. This reminds me of one of the quotes we read earlier from the internet. Hebrews 13, verse 1 says, let brotherly love continue. Verse 2, do not forget to entertain strangers. And we're not talking about, putting on a dance show or whatever. We're talking about hospitality here. Don't forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing, some have unwittingly entertained angels. Remember that quote we read? Greet the stranger as if you were greeting God. Let's look at a couple of those examples. They're in the Bible here. Look at Genesis chapter 18. Way back in Genesis. This is a very age-old concept that still exists in certain parts of the world to an extent. Not as much in our society today. But Genesis 18, and we'll begin in verse 1 here. The Lord appeared to Abraham here by the terebinth trees of Mamre as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and he looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground. Remember, he didn't just stay there and wait for them to come. He ran out to meet them. That was part of biblical hospitality. You go out, you meet them, you escort them back. And we see that in a number of places throughout the Old Testament. Verse 3, and he said, my Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Please, let a little water be brought. He didn't know who these people were. There were no introductions yet. He hadn't inquired about anything. But immediately he says, hey, I see you're traveling by, but don't pass by. Let a little water be brought to wash your feet. Take care of your needs, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread. Just exactly like the definitions we were reading earlier. That you may refresh your hearts, and that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant. And they said, do as you've said. So they agreed. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, quickly make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender of good calf, gave it to a young man, and hastened to prepare it. And he took butter and milk and the calf which he'd prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate, as their servant, right? He stood there and he prepared the meal for them and then stood there and made sure their needs were taken care of while they ate. Strangers. Just passing by. This is a lot of effort he went through to take care of them. Well, imagine how society might look if we all functioned this way. I remember a time when you traveled without one of these. And it's kind of interesting how soon things change, because I have on occasion left this laying at the house, and I get out somewhere and I think, oh no, what if something happens? Used not to ever be a problem before these things came along. At least not where I grew up, in kind of a rural area. People took care of one another. If you broke down, you broke down. You just got outside your car and waited about 2 minutes. And someone would show up. Hey, you need some help? People were hospitable. Yeah, I need some help. Thank you. I remember one time my wife and I, we were going to go on a wonderful trip, and we were going to go on a canoe trip and camp, and just she and I getting away, and we got down and we got whatever vehicle we had at that time, we got it stuck. Stuck bad in the mud on the side of the road trying to get down to the water, and couldn't do anything. Had a boat on top of the car, man. And it was like midnight because we left late, dropped the kids off. I think it was a Saturday night, and after church we just got rid of the kids, dropped the kids off. And we were going to go and just set up late, and we're like, oh man, we're in the middle of nowhere. We're stuck. I mean, stuck. I was covered about, head to toe mud trying to get this vehicle out. And what are we going to do? And then this great big pickup truck with tires about this tall comes down the road, sees us somehow down in this gully beside the bridge where we were, pulls up, and there's three guys get out high as a kite. I don't know what they were smoking or drinking or whatever it was. But they look, hey man, you need some help? Looks like you're stuck. And even under that condition, it kicked into people back at that time. You need help. Let's help this guy. Come on, this is going to be great. And they threw ropes on the car and their truck and spun up a bunch of mud, and we got out, and it was wonderful. Far different from some of the examples we're going to read here, and some of the biblical examples of when people did not exercise hospitality. But continuing here, we see Abraham's example down in verse 9. They said to him, "Where's your Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "Here in the tent." And he said, "I'll certainly return to you." And of course, this is whenever they told Sarah she was going to have a baby and so forth in her old age. And she laughed and then denied it. But coming on down then to verse 16, the men rose from there, and they looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on the way. So after the meal was complete, he followed them. They had made a covenant, and this was the covenant with Sarah. They told him, hey, well, this is what's going to happen. And then Abraham got up and followed them on their way, make sure their needs were taken care of, and they had another conversation there at that point. Let's turn over to chapter 19, though. Chapter 19, we'll see an example of hospitality practiced and not practiced in the same episode here. Genesis 19, verse 1, two of those three men, the angels, came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. And so here was Lot. And when Lot saw them, here they were coming, he saw them coming from the gate, he rose to meet them. So he went out to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground and said, "Here now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night." These are just people walking up to the gate of the city. He didn't know who they were. "But come spend the night with me. Come to my house." It's a completely different concept than what we're used to in our society. "And wash your feet." So that need was taken care of. It was something, everybody walked. They walked with sandals through the desert. It was a big need, a big concern for them. So come in and spend the night, wash your feet, and then you may rise early and go your way. And they said, "No, we'll spend the night out in the open." But he insisted strongly, so they turned into him, and they entered his house. And he made them a feast, and he baked unleavened bread, and they ate. So again, we see that. Take care of the feet, take care of the food, do all these things. And before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said to him, "Where are those men who came to you tonight?" Now, these individuals did not have hospitality, not the right kind of hospitality. "Bring them out to us, that we may know them carnally." So Lot went out to them to the doorway. He shut the door behind him and said, "Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly." See, now, we always tend to focus on one thing here in relation to the name Sodom in this situation. And that certainly was something terrible, and that was certainly a crime against God and his law. But there's another element at play here that we often overlook, probably always. These men had come under Lot's protection. When Lot took them into his home, he was obligated to protect these men under the rules of hospitality. And this was significant. We're going to see another episode where this was so very significant. And Lot, of course, said, "See, I have two daughters who have not known a man." Please let me bring them out to you and do with them as you wish, only do nothing to these men. And as abominable as that was itself, we see how strong a custom of hospitality was. Because the daughters, under that time, under that society, those were lots to negotiate with, you might say. I mean, as bad as that sounds to us today. But he had a strict rule to protect those men. They were under his household. Do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they've come under the shadow of my roof. I brought them in here to protect them. This is the reason they came under the shadow of my roof. And the men said, stand back. And they said, this one came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as if he's a judge, and we'll deal worse with you than with them. So they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break down the door, but the men, the two angels, Lot didn't recognize them as such, it doesn't appear, but that's who they were, reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door, and they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great. So they became weary trying to find the door. So Lot had exercised hospitality, but the men of Sodom certainly did not, in conjunction with their other sin, and Sodom suffered and Lot was blessed. I mean, we see the contrast there. So two examples where Abraham went out to meet strangers. Lot went out to meet strangers, as was the custom, as was the rules of hospitality, and they entertained angels there. Let's look at Judges chapter 19. Another example similar to what we just read about Sodom. Judges 19 and verse 15. Sometimes we may not think of this particular episode in the light of hospitality. But Judges 19 and verse 15, here they turned aside. This was a man, his concubine, a servant, turned aside there to go in to lodge in Gibeah. And when he went in, he sat down in the open square of the city, for no one would take them into his house to spend the night. Well, this was what you might say, this didn't speak highly of the city where he was. No one would take him in to his house to spend the night. A city can get a reputation very quickly, just like an individual. I remember we lived in a city in North Georgia. One morning, my wife called, and she says, I can't get to work. The vehicle, whatever it was at that time, broke down. And I said, where are you? She said, well, I'm at the intersection of such and such. I'm at the service station. I was getting gas, and now the car won't crank. I said, oh, okay. Well, there's 50,000 people an hour go through that intersection and in and out of that store. I know where you are. I was getting ready. Said, it's 45 minutes before I can get to you because of traffic and so forth. But I'm sure somebody will be there, to help you out any moment here. But I'll be there. And let me know if somebody gets you taken care of on the way. 45 minutes later, I got there. There's the vehicle, the hood up, 3 small kids in the car walking around it, my wife. Right at the service station, all sorts of people coming and going. Has anybody offered to help? No, no one. I've been here 45 minutes, not a single person. It was that day I said, we're moving from the city. And we did. A city can get a reputation like that, and that's what happened here. They turned aside to go and lodge in Gibeah, but no one would take them in to spend the night. In verse 16, then an old man came in from his work in the field at that evening, who was also from the mountains of Ephraim, and he was staying in Gibeah, whereas the men of the place were Benjamites. And when he raised his eyes, he saw the traveler on the open square of the city, and the old man said, where are you going, and where do you come from? He said, we're passing from Bethlehem to Judah toward the remote mountains of Ephraim. I'm from there. So he identified himself as a traveler, a sojourner. I went to Bethlehem in Judah. Now I'm going to the house of the Lord, but there's no one who will take me into his house. So I'm stuck out here in the open. Although we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for myself. It's not even a big, you don't even have to take care of us. We just want to get out of the open square. For your female servant, for the young man who is with your servant, there's no lack of anything. And the old man said, peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. This man was hospitable. One individual came in and practiced it appropriately. Let all your needs be my responsibility. Keep what you've got. Only do not spend the night in the open square. So he brought them in the house, gave fodder to the donkeys, washed their feet. They ate and drank. Here we go again. Same custom. As they were enjoying themselves, of course, certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house, beat on the doors, spoke to the master of the house and the old man, saying, bring out the man who came to your house so we may know him carnally. An age-old problem there. But the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, oh, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly, seeing this man has come into my house. Do not commit this charge. So he didn't say, do not commit this outrage. He said, seeing as this man has come into my house, he's under my protection. Don't do this. And again, just like in the first episode, he offered his virgin daughter, the man's concubine, and so forth. And we know then that ultimately the concubine was taken out, came back, and died the next morning. And this man took the concubine and severed her into 12 pieces and sent her to the various tribes of Israel and charged Gibeah with this crime. But it wasn't just a crime of passion, of offense, of violence. It was a crime of hospitality. You see, in a society, especially like that society, if you couldn't rely on your neighbor to help you and take care of you, then society couldn't really function very well, could it? How could trade take place? I mean, look at the risk associated with trade and so forth. If you're trying to travel from one city to another by foot with a camel through the middle of the desert, and you know you can't reach the next destination in time, and there's no inns that you can stop at to so forth, you have to rely on other people to help you out to get there, just to function as a society. And if that starts to break down, and you can't trust one another, you can't trust your neighbor to help you, things can't function. This was also a crime against hospitality, and the Benjamites were nearly wiped out as a result of these crimes. Let's look at Luke 9. Go back to the New Testament here. Some more verses we've probably never thought of from this perspective. Luke chapter 9 and verse 1. Here's when Christ called his 12 disciples together, and he gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. What an exciting time this must have been. And in verse 2, he sent them to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. And he said to them, take nothing for the journey, neither staffs, nor bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not have 2 tunics apiece. Don't weigh yourself down for this mission. Whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. You know, we might look at this and say, wow, these guys had so much faith. Well, they just went out with nothing to preach the gospel. They went out with the expectation that people would fulfill their obligation, that their needs would be taken care of, that they would be met. They could do this. Whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. And whoever will not receive you, now listen to this charge, whoever will not receive you, when you go out of that city, shake off the very dust from your feet as a testimony against them. Was he saying that whoever will not receive the word? Whoever will not receive the truth? That's not listed in this verse, though they were sent out to preach the gospel. He says, go and enter their house. And he says, whoever will not receive you, shake off the very dust from your feet as a testimony against them. They violated the rules of hospitality. So they departed and went through the towns, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. It allowed the work to flourish, the rules of hospitality. They were very important. Because at that time, there was no media to put into everyone's home. You had to go from house to house to house, which means you had to do a lot of traveling out on the road. And imagine the resources that you would have to have at your disposal if you had to stay at an inn, if you had to have the transportation to go during that time, and there was no place to, all the packed caravans and animals and food you'd have to take along the journey. I mean, it would be an extraordinary undertaking to try to go out and do the gospel, preach the gospel the way these men do, except there was hospitality. And these men could go carrying nothing and rely on people to help them along the way. Look at chapter 10, just over chapter 10 and verse 1. After all these things, the Lord appointed 70 others also. And he sent them 2 by 2 before his face to every city and place where he himself was about to go. And he said, the harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into the harvest. Go your way. Behold, I send you out as lambs among wolves. Carry neither money bag, knapsack, nor sandals. Greet no one along the road, but whatever house you enter, first say, peace to this house. That was the obligation, to give a blessing to the host. The guest was to bless the host. Peace to this house. And if a son of peace is there, your peace will rest on it. If not, it will return to you. And remain in the same house, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the laborer is worthy of his wages. Do not go from house to house, but whatever city you enter and they receive you, eat such things as they set before you. Heal the sick there, and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. Again, bless them. But whatever city you enter and they do not receive you, go out into its streets and say, the very dust of your city which clings to us, we wipe off against you. Nevertheless, know this, the kingdom of God has come near to you. It's hospitality. This is cities that are offending and holding up the work of God because of not exercising hospitality, essentially, is what we're looking at here. The work could not be done in certain cities because the city was not hospitable. Let's look back at chapter 9. Chapter 9, verse 51, just back a few verses. It came to pass when the time had come for him to be received up, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers before his face. And they entered the village of the Samaritans to prepare for him, but they did not receive him. They did not receive him because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. Here he was traveling. And when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said to the Lord, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Just as Elijah did. What was their offense? They didn't give him a place to stay. They didn't receive him. You see, this is something God finds important. They didn't receive us. Should we? But he turned and rebuked them and says, what manner of spirit you are of here? The Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And then they went to another village. But it shows what an offense that was in the minds of the disciples. People in this city will not receive us. What mentality are they of? Should we destroy them? Might cause a shift in our way of thinking about hospitality. Let's look at Luke 12, since we're still here in Luke. Luke chapter 12, verse 22. Hospitality is very important, and Christ demonstrates it himself and how he treats us. Luke 12:22, I say to you, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat, nor about the body, what you'll put on. Because life's more than food, the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap, which have neither storehouse nor barn, and God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature? So if you then are not able to do the least, why are you anxious for the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, and yet I say to you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. If God so clothes the grass, which today is in the field and tomorrow is thrown in the oven, how much more will he clothe you? Oh, you of little faith. He's going to take care of your needs. He's going to make you his responsibility. And do not seek what you should eat or what you should drink, nor have an anxious mind. You're under my protection. Your needs are my responsibility. For all these things the nations of the world seek after, and your Father knows that you need these things, but seek the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added to you. Christ is hospitable towards us. Says he's going to take care of us. Look at John 14. Something we might not think of in this context. And yet it's exactly what's taking place here. John 14, verse 1. Again, Christ says, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. But I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go prepare a place for you, I'll come again and receive you to myself. He's going to come back and receive us. He's going to meet us and receive us. He's preparing a place for us. Christ is hospitable. This is this whole concept. It's what it's teaching us throughout the Bible. For where I am, there you may also be. We'll have the right to stay with him. And where I go, you know, and the way you know. You know, just for kicks, think about 1 Thessalonians 4. You know, we won't turn there because of time, but what does it say is going to happen at the last trump? Christ will descend, and we will meet him in the air. We think about what's got to take place, a wedding supper and so forth. Where's that going to be? Under the rules of hospitality, Christ would come to meet us and escort us back. And then, of course, after the wedding supper, we know there's some major activity going to take place, right, on this earth. But we see Christ come descend in the air to meet. When we think about hospitality, what do we think of? How should it apply in our lives today? Write down some ways you think it might be important. Think about it. How can we apply it? How can we exercise it in our lives? So when you think about the concept and what we've learned thus far, think about when Christ was born. This was amazing to me. I just thought of this yesterday as I was thinking about it. You know, the word says he stayed at an inn. I went and I looked and did a little study on it and what an inn was. It just means lodging place. And there are different ideas about what the lodging place might have been at that time. But it was not an inn like a hotel like we have. This is not what was going on. It wasn't necessarily a stable either. A stable was probably just a part of someone's home, most likely. But there was no place found for them. And when we see what we've learned so far about accommodating someone traveling, and there was no room found for them, it's really kind of an offense. Here the Savior the Messiah is being born, and they can't find room for him. No one has room to take him in, even from the beginning of his life. Let's look at Proverbs 25, because we've talked about this, but we need to also understand the world we live in, and we need to understand that there's balance in all things, and that we have to exercise wisdom. Proverbs 25, verse 17. Seldom set foot in your neighbor's house, lest he become weary of you and hate you. Don't take advantage of your neighbors. They have the obligation to take care of you. We have the obligation to take care of one another. But don't be that person who overstays the welcome, who takes advantage. You know, Paul said in 2 Thessalonians, you don't work, you don't eat. And we have an obligation to take care of our own needs as well. There are times when we're in need, whether it be because we're traveling, we're broke down, we're going through some other type of crisis, and we need help. And we should feel comfortable relying on one another for that. But this is not an avenue for us to take advantage of one another. So we have to understand what this concept's really all about. I had a good friend who I knew in high school and then worked with for a while. We were lifeguards together. I used to despise it when he would come out of the guard shack because he looked better than me, and all the women would turn and look at him. I was like, go back inside. What are you doing? Big-hearted guy. He took in a guy who was down on his luck because he was doing acid all the time and lost his job and had all sorts of problems, and he thought he would help the guy out, and the guy killed him and stuffed him in his freezer and lived off his credit cards for a few months before the police finally came and found him living in his freezer, stuffed in his freezer. So we've got to exercise wisdom. You know, we want an open door to the stranger. We want to be able to help one another out, but we've got to also be wise. What are some things we can do? Look at Luke again. We'll go back to Luke chapter 14. Just some ideas. I hope you're all thinking of ideas of how you could be hospitable in this day and this age, the way God expects us to be. Luke 14, verse 1, it happened as Christ went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath that they watched him closely. Just throw that verse out there because it's one of the ways that they were being hospitable toward Christ. Christ could expect to go in and eat at someone's home, and they would be expected to provide the meal, and vice versa. People would see someone's need, they would prepare the meal and invite someone. So, I mean, this is just a real simple, easy way, one that's very biblical. Sharing a meal to help someone out is absolutely in line with the biblical concept of hospitality. Down to verse 12. When you give a dinner or supper, don't just ask your friends, or it says, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just. So certainly it's not wrong to invite our friends, but we shouldn't limit it just to that. That gets a little out of our comfort zone for today's age, and we have to exercise wisdom. But it's something we should practice as much as we can. Let's look at Matthew 25. An admonition for us to remember. Matthew 25 and verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the holy angels with him, he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he'll separate them one from another as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he'll set the sheep on the right hand, the goats on the left, and the king will say to those on his right hand, Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Why? For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Hospitality. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, you visited me. I was in prison, you came to me. The righteous will answer and say, Lord, when do we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty, give you drink? And he said, When do you see a stranger take you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison or come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, Assuredly, I say, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of my brethren, you did it to me. That's what God expects from us. He expects us to exercise hospitality, enter into his kingdom. Just like he expected the widow to be able to receive assistance, he expects it from all of us to enter into his kingdom. And of course, as we continue down, we see those who didn't practice that concept not making it. So let's do our best to learn to show love towards our neighbor through hospitality. And as mentioned at the beginning, I'm a little bit hypocritical talking about this. It's something I've got to learn to practice more myself. But it's not something that we can say, well, this is just the way I am and make an excuse for it or whatever. And we've got to learn to apply it in our lives. So we learned a little bit about what hospitality is. I hope it'll guide us into an even deeper study of that. We've seen how it was used in the Bible, shedding some light on some customs, why things happen the way they happen in those times, why some battles took place. Maybe shed some light on understanding what's going to happen at the end of the age. Look a little further into the subject. See how to practice it in your life. Hopefully it'll broaden our understanding of certain subjects and events besides those we've already looked at, or broaden our understanding of those even further. Think about ways we can be hospitable to each other, to newcomers, to strangers. And let's conclude with Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12 and verse 9. Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil and cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor, giving preference to one another. This is a hospitable attitude. Not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer, distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality.